Lotta, can you please just start by identifying yourself? I'm Katherine Ellison. I'm a journalist and author, especially of the family memoir buzz, A Year of Paying Attention,
Yeah.
and interviewing you for the Inattentive ADHD Coalition, and really interested to hear about your research. But tell us a little bit about yourself to begin with.
Yeah. So my name is Lotta Borg Skoglund. I'm a Swedish psychiatrist by training and a researcher. I'm an associate professor at the Department for Women and Children's Health in Uppsala University and also affiliated to Karolinska Institutet. My research is focusing mainly on ADHD, and I wrote my doctoral thesis almost 10 years ago about ADHD and substance use disorders. Then I got interested in the female perspective and the gender differences in ADHD specifically, but the role of the sex hormones and when the hormones come into play. That is my main research focus and my main clinical focus. I'm trying to build an app that we call Letter Life that is designed to be a tool actually for girls and women with ADHD. And
Letter Life? Is that what it's?
Yeah, it's called Letter Life. In Swedish, that would be the letters of the alphabet, the A, B, C, ADHD, ASD, all the letters, all the diagnoses. In psychiatry, we tend to have these acronyms for different diagnoses. It doesn't really matter what diagnosis you have, but rather that you have all these letters that is constantly a part of your life. That is what we are building, me and a couple of tech people skilled in that department. I am trying to fill this app with the research and the current knowledge that we have about female ADHD and female autism and different neurodevelopmental diagnoses.
Interesting. The app is just an easy access to research. Is it written in a more engaging, popular way?
That is exactly what it is. I've tried to write everything, all the content in the app, in the same way that I talk to my patients. We are building it together with a panel of lead patient users, so a panel of girls and women with ADHD, and a panel of researchers and clinicians. We're trying to merge their perspective and see what is the gap between what healthcare aims to provide and what women actually need and are looking for. That gap we try to identify through research and through qualitative interview studies. Then we create that content for self-care and for empowerment and self-efficacy.
The gap you're talking about is the gap between diagnosis and medication versus how to live your life, how to take care of you. Right.
Exactly. We looked at this population in Sweden, large-scale epidemiological studies, where we see that girls and women are diagnosed approximately 4 years later than boys and men. These 4 years, the years around puberty and adolescence, are so formative for these girls and young women. When we fail to see them and support them, they develop more negative consequences that is associated with ADHD.
Eating disorders, depression, anxiety, right? Suicide attempts.
Yeah. Everything common psychiatric comorbidities in the general population, like anxiety and depression. Of course, we already knew that girls and women were overrepresented in those diagnoses, but also we see the more serious outcomes, such as suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, severe eating disorders, severe OCD, and substance use, of course. Our research has also focused more specifically on the reproductive outcomes. When we fail to identify and recognize these girls and young women, they tend to grow up with lower self-esteem, struggling more in social relationships. Many have experienced different kinds of risk-taking behaviors just due to their wanting to belong, their longing to be accepted and to be part of something. One girl said, I would let almost anyone do almost anything with me just to be accepted and just to be a part of a society or a community. That is so sad, but also so true for so many of these women. She's far from alone. And what we see when you don't get that diagnosis, you don't get the explanatory model that you need to get the right support and take better care of yourself.
What is an ideal for girls to be diagnosed in your perspective?
Sorry, what?
What is the ideal age for girls to be diagnosed, do you think?
I think that's a very interesting question. So I would say any age where the girl herself enters a situation where she feels overwhelmed or where she feels she can't handle the demands of the everyday life. And the difficult thing with girls is that girls, compared to boys, tend to develop this social awareness of what other people expect from them at an earlier age. What we see is that girls at an earlier age starts to adapt and starts to mask and starts to find strategies and find ways to disguise their problems, their symptoms, their difficulties, making them then harder actually for people around them to recognize. The importance of the diagnosis is it is not, if you're not attentive and if you're not aware of the different displays of young girls with ADHD, it is difficult to find them when they need diagnosis. But the research is very clear there that the earlier you get your diagnosis and the support tailored towards that diagnosis, the better outcomes we can expect. So I would say at any age where the girl starts to struggle, but it's not always that the people around, the parents, the teachers, or the healthcare professional realize that she is struggling.
So should there be a more systematic way of finding these girls at a certain age, given that the parents might not be aware, the girls might not be aware that they could actually get help if they said something?
Yeah, and it is difficult to screen for these symptoms. And that is the kind of challenge with ADHD and other neurodevelopmental disorders in general. These symptoms are extremes of a behavior that everyone can recognize themselves in. Everyone can feel overwhelmed. Everyone can feel restless. Everyone can feel like they have difficulties concentrating on stuff when it's not interesting enough, or having symptoms of depression and anxiety due to external stressors in life. But when it comes to ADHD, it is these girls and women, they are struggling on the top maximum of their cognitive abilities every day. These stressors and moving through life and the different stages and the different challenges that people may say, everyone struggles, or these are just normal challenges of a normal life. But if you are functioning on the top of your cognitive abilities every day, then what the people around you see as just normal challenges might be the thing that actually is the last straw. Or yeah, exactly, the last blow that you can take, and then everything falls apart.
You wait that long, just to be clear, so you're not getting some kind of systematic screening at a certain age, but rather waiting for these girls to have such trouble that they actually ask help.
So that is basically what happens today. I meet so many of these girls that have been assessed, where the question has been raised, but since there are no gender-specific screening tools, and since there are these differences in gender expression and the female specific challenges that are not recognized, these girls may have been on our radar long before they get their diagnosis. If you look at Swedish data, they would typically get their diagnosis late adolescent or early adult life. They have gone undiagnosed across extremely formative and important years of their life.
It sounds like you're saying that the screening needs to change to be more aware of girl symptoms.
I would say that awareness and knowledge, we need to raise the knowledge about female-specific symptoms and how girls may present, specifically pre-pubertal girls, how they present with their ADHD symptoms.
Have you looked at differences between the way that the United States and Sweden treats ADHD? Is there more stigma in one place or another?
That's a great question. Since I'm not clinically active in the US, I can only rely on the research that I read and the colleagues that I discuss with. But I would say that Sweden and the US are quite similar in that sense. But in small Sweden, we are only like 10 million people here. Still, there are huge differences across geographic areas, socioeconomic areas, that it is almost not possible to say that in Sweden, this is how it is. So in certain part of Sweden, we have huge numbers, actually exceeding the prevalence numbers even for girls. That is really unusual, because what we see is that typically boys around 12 to 13, 14 years, that the prevalence numbers for boys have gone up in certain part of the world. But to be that high even for girls, that is unusual. But these are very limited, very specific areas. So there might be other areas not far from that where it's still almost no girls diagnosed at all. That is the case for US as well, that you see this massive prevalence, and then everyone focus on that and say, this is outrageous. And then you forget that ADHD can be over and underdiagnosed at the same time. That's really important to highlight. We need to keep these two thoughts in our heads at the same time going forward if we want to do right by the girls.
What got you so interested in ADHD? And what sparked your interest in ADHD?
First, actually, it was my background in addiction medicine, because I worked in a addiction clinic for adolescents. I met all these unhappy and unfortunate young people, teenagers that came because they had too much to drink, they got intoxicated, or they ended up in trouble for they took drugs or something. And they came to my clinic and we talked. And then it was apparent to me that it wasn't really fair who got into trouble. So it seemed to me that there were some of these adolescents that once they tried alcohol or drugs, they immediately. And then there was some adolescents that could try and could do a little of this and do a little of that, and then they got bored with that and they moved on and they continued with it. So why is this not fair? During my early teenage years, when I first tried alcohol, I had a really hard time figuring out how to dose it, and ended up in quite some difficult situations that could have been much worse. But I also looked at my friends, and so many of them never had these negative experiences.
Did you suspect that you might have ADHD?
Yeah, when I grew up, that vision came much later in my life, because it was really unusual. Even when I was a young adult, it was really unusual for adult women to have this diagnosis. No one really thought about that. When a colleague of mine suggested that when I was in my 30s, I was just like, no way, why should that be? Then I started reading up. I actually got interested in it before, and then I got my own diagnosis. I came from the addiction side, and that is also what my doctoral thesis was about. I have stayed in that lane of the groups that we miss. I've had a special focus on addiction. I have a special focus on girls. I also have special focus on the elderly. Once ADHD got on everyone's, got up to the knowledge of almost everyone, we started to actually diagnose the boys first. The research, almost every study up until lately was done on pre-pubertal boys. So adding the sex hormones to that mix, I found extremely interesting why no one had ever even asked those questions before.
If it's okay to ask a personal question, what kinds of symptoms do you think you were having?
I can see very clearly now, in retrospect, that my brain definitely has this spiky, uneven profile. I have really profound difficulties with, for example, working memory that made me feel that I was really stupid. I struggled so much in certain parts of not math in general, but trying to calculate things in your head. I had so much difficulties in that. I also found certain things very easy and natural. I very early realized that this is not something that I can train. It didn't matter how much effort I put in it. I did not manage it. That almost killed me, because I am a very stubborn person. I wanted to become a doctor, and I knew that I had to have top grades. I carried around this big secret that my brain was like cheese with holes in it. Right. I couldn't accept that I wouldn't reach my goals. I almost killed myself trying to study to manage those areas that I found so difficult. When you want to be a doctor, then you need to have your science. Biology was fine. I love biology, but then you have to have math. And yeah, I just struggled so much with that.
You talk a lot about what will help. We wanted to get into that.
What strategies did you find to help yourself before we talk about helping?
Before I got my diagnosis or after?
What about after?
After, yeah.
How did you diagnose
you? I was diagnosed in my 30s something. I've had my diagnosis for about 15 years now. It was really helpful and really a new way of looking at life and myself, and also throwing out a lot of the malignant and dysfunctional strategies that I have had worked up. I was really tough on myself. I was so disciplined that I almost didn't enjoy my life. Once I realized that this was what I was battling, I could find much more constructive and sustainable strategies. I need to be disciplined, but discipline is not the same as being masochistic or denying yourself everything that is fun and good and enjoyable and spontaneous. I have a much lighter outlook on life now. I allow myself to do a lot of the things that my ADHD brain wants to do, but within a framework of always looking out for my main lifestyle factors. The most important lesson for me was to get in charge of my hormones, to understand how they fluctuate and how that affects my ADHD symptoms and my overall mental health and my emotional regulation. Then once your hormonal cycle, you can be much more tentative and careful around yourself in the vulnerable periods and have a predictive outlook in knowing that you are entering a period where you probably will feel that your emotions may overwhelm you, or you need more sleep, or you have to be extra careful not to skip your gym exercise, or that you should definitely not have alcohol. But you tolerate alcohol perfectly fine in a part of your menstrual cycle. That has been really crucial for me.
Is it the same for all women? Are there 4 days before your period you shouldn't drink? All these things happen, or?
It's very individual, but every woman do get affected by hormonal fluctuation. If you have a contraceptive that kind of evens out the fluctuations, then you might not be affected by it in the same way. But if you look at the menstrual cycle and the data that reveals that estrogen levels interact with dopamine levels, and the dopamine is often dysregulated when you have ADHD. The dopamine can influence and affect with ADHD.
Can you tell us the similarities between dopamine dysregulation?
Yeah, so what we know from animal studies, though, because the research hasn't come this far yet, but that many women and girls testify to, is that during a 28-day menstrual cycle, if you have the average menstrual cycle, it can be 24 or 20 or 32 days, but let's say for simplicity's sake that it's 28 days. Then the first 14 days will be the follicular phase where your estrogen levels increases. Estrogen and dopamine levels interact and modulate each other's effect. During the follicular phase, during the increased estrogen levels, many women with ADHD feel that they have better control over their ADHD symptoms.
Because your dopamine levels are higher too? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Because your estrogen levels stabilizes and modulate and increase your dopamine levels. But then around ovulation, the estrogen level peak. For some women and girls who have a more impulsive form of ADHD, these estrogen plus dopamine can be a situation where you feel overstimulated, especially if you have ADHD medication, the same dose. Yeah. So around these days, some women feel like they're overstimulated. They feel so alive and so happy, and they want to go party and a drink. I find that perfectly understandable, because then after the estrogen levels drops off to a more stable level during the luteal phase, many women feel that their ADHD medication doesn't work anymore. They find that their ADHD symptoms is much more difficult to regulate, and that they get this emotional dysregulation and dysphoria and the PMS and the PMDD. For some women, 2 weeks of this PMS hell, it is a welcome relief when you have this more ecstatic or jet phase. But the consequences may be equally dramatic, right? The consequences from dysphoric mode can be like conflicts, it can be suicidal thoughts, it can be relapse into eating disorder, it can be relapse into alcoholism. So that might be really like negative consequences associated with the luteal phase, where progesterone levels are increasing, right? The consequences might be equally malignant if you act out on the more impulsive, overstimulated phase. And what we're trying to do with the Letter Life app is make sure that you are on top of where you are, and you start to tracking your ADHD symptoms and to track your lifestyle factors, your diet, your sleep, exercise, how you handle relationships, how you handle your life structure, if you remember to take your medications. All those factors are so important.
Sounds so smart. Does medication play a role during the cycle? Should it be increased or decreased?
Again, that is individual, but what we know is that the medication is affected by hormonal fluctuation. That is why it's so important, and why we are trying to get all women to monitor their cycles and collect their own data. And you can advocate for yourself and for your healthcare professionals to make better medical decisions. Otherwise, I will, as a doctor, end up making my decision based on research made on boys. This is a very flawed model for the girls and for the women. We have to collect the data about ourselves, and we have to go to our healthcare professionals saying, this is how my ADHD works. Should I perhaps employ a cyclic dosing regime here? Because it might be that you want to decrease your dose when you are around ovulation to avoid being overstimulated and engage in risk-taking behavior. Or you want to increase your dose slightly during the luteal phase to avoid PMS and the emotional dysregulation that goes on around that period.
When you think about it, it's almost like nature wants us to run out and be reckless with our bodies, raising dopamine and estrogen at the same time. You call your research project Goddess. Can you tell us what that means?
We came up with the Goddess acronym. It's a very not humble acronym, right? But we're calling it itself Goddess ADHD. And we say it's gender-informed research to overcome diagnostic delay, empowering self-awareness and self-efficacy in female ADHD. There are the Goddess letters in bold statement that we want to achieve and aim with our research.
That's a beautiful summary of what you're doing.
Yeah, we thought it was because we're standing on the shoulders of giants in this field, but there has not been that many that has actually had this focus. We are extremely humble to what we are building, trying to build, because it is such a huge, skewed research. The body of literature is so skewed towards the boys and men.
No, it's terrific that you're doing this. Do you have any other ideas about how to get more young girls diagnosed?
We need to increase the general knowledge in schools and in healthcare and among parents. There are some important stigma also to fight. Looking at research, it seems like parents are more embarrassed of having a girl. A daughter is more shameful than a boy, than a son. That is one obstacle to overcome. These girls, what they tell us is that they don't feel accepted by their peers, and that adults don't like them. When teachers and healthcare professionals describe these girls, it has a negative connotation. Of course, these clever, receptive girls pick up on that. They feel that they're not likable and that they're not accepted. That is a huge and important thing. We have to increase the knowledge that ADHD is not a choice. This is not a choice for these girls. They are grabbing for whatever they can get to understand themselves and to understand the world and make sense of everything, they are shamed for it.
Why would it be more shameful for a parent to have a girl with ADHD than a boy?
I guess that will point to gender norms, right? What is a typical girl like? What is a typical boy like? Boys will be boys. We have a greater acceptance for a variety. A boy can be, it's a super social, a football, soccer boy, or he can be also the nerdy or semi-autistic boy with his hyper interest. But we have a much narrower focus and social expectations, I fear, for girls.
Is there anything else that you think that parents and girls should know about ADHD?
You need to know that you have to advocate for yourself and for your daughter. Many people in healthcare and in the education system will not understand what you are trying to say, that you are fighting for your daughter's life. Basically, this is extremely important. Having lived an undetected, unrecognized girl myself, I have thought about this at length, of course. What did I wish that other had done back then, and could it be different? I always end up with wanting to armor girls and their mothers and their parents and give them the best possible tools. You have to get to know yourself, collect the data about yourself, and advocate for yourself until the healthcare and the research has caught up with us.
I love what you say on your website. You start off by saying, is ADHD overdiagnosed? No, it should be taken more seriously.
All of us have to know what we risk when we don't take it seriously. There's nothing to gain from invalidating people. In Sweden, anyway, we are scared about the costs for medication and for assessments and for healthcare costs. But the research we have points to the cost of undiagnosed, the personal cost, the cost for significant others, and for society. When I get accused by my colleagues that I talk too much about ADHD and that there are other diagnoses out there that might be equally important, I say, you can think whatever you want, but these patients are your patients already because of the comorbidity that will develop if you don't get diagnosed in time. That would be my final word. So you say that we are here, regardless of what you would want to call us, if you want to see us or not. I'm a living example of how much responsibility you are able to take on once properly diagnosed. Otherwise, probably I would have to lean on healthcare for depression, for anxiety, for other psychic consequences. Now I am perfectly functioning and doing well. That is one case, but I see it all the time. I meet these girls and women that flourish when they get the right diagnosis.
That's wonderful to hear, and it's just been terrific to talk with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks you for having me.
Cynthia, do you want to ask anything?
One reason girls should get diagnosed before age 8 is I thought then they wouldn't have learned to mask yet. At what age do you think they're socially aware enough to start masking?
When they were 3, 4, they're looking around. And especially if you're a smart little girl, the research was suggesting that the girls realize that at an earlier age than boys. But I think 8 is a good age because it is with increasing demands in school and increasing demands on the executive functions where the girls more often have the inattentive, the more loading on executive dysfunction than the boys where they have more of the impulsive and the hyperactive. The girls tend to become more and more impaired with time, whereas for boys, it's not. The impulsivity and the hyperactivity tend to decrease when they get into puberties. The girls, we want to target them and support them and get them the right explanatory model at an early age as possible. Then 8 is a good age because it's between grade school
and middle school.
Yeah. Exactly. So it's a good age because girls particularly struggle with phases of transition. So what you find them in a phase where they are more stable because then you have time to get the treatments and the accommodations in place.
In the U.S., until the 5th grade, you still have one class with one teacher. After that, you have more teachers. It's harder for a child to be identified.
Exactly. Yeah. The girls are invisible even before, so they become even more invisible. Now the classes are getting bigger. We have a much higher demand for executive functions and for self-regulation at an earlier age. There are a lot of factors that play into these increasing prevalence numbers. There's a society that is so cognitive demanding than it was 20 years ago when I grew up.
Yes. All right, give us a lot to think about.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of interesting questions and really made me think about things that I haven't thought about for a long time. So that was really good.
Cool. Thanks again so much.
Thank you.
Good.
Bye.
Bye.
We believe all girls with ADHD should get a fair start in life by getting diagnosed by age 8. Visit us at www.FINDtheADHDgirls.org. Thank you.